My name is Karoline Lewis, and I'm the Marbury E. Anderson Chair in Biblical Preaching at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. It used to be that people would think, oh, we're past that, we're beyond sort of a post-feminist reality, but we aren't, particularly in the church. And if anything, the church is far, far more behind than the secular world when it comes to women's roles. And it can do that from a place of a theological argument, which makes it even more difficult. So that's why I wrote it. I wrote it for this class, but then for all of my students, it's dedicated to the students in that class. And then for women who are going into ministry, who are in ministry, and for everybody who wants to come alongside them and accompany them and support them. Yeah, ordination has been since 1970, at least in the Lutheran Church, sooner in other denominations. But of course, there's all kinds of denominations which refuse to ordain women or put women in leadership roles. And Otis Moss said at the Festival of Homiletics this year, by not allowing women in leadership roles in the church is operating at 50%. So when you put it in that kind of perspective, to realize the church can only really operate, can only really function at 50% capacity because it's eliminating 50% of its population. So that's one way to put it. For me, what's at stake is a theological claim that since God committed God's self to being a human being, I very much doubt that God thought, I think I'm just going to be a guy, and that I'm only going to commit myself to half of the incarnation or half of what it means to be human. So if we take God seriously and we say uh, this is a God who is fully committed to what does it mean to be a human being, then and what does it mean to embody the Word, then women have to be a part of that. I think it is a hard question. I think in part why I wrote the book is that I don't think they're changing. Or at least, I mean, maybe your answer is right. It's slow. It's so unbelievably slow. And that is maybe the incredible frustration. And it seems like we get so far, and then there's resistance, and and the imagination for women in ministry ends up taking a number of steps back, depending on sort of how culturally people are dealing with feminism and women in general. And the reality is, our culture hasn't really changed when it comes to sexism, patriarchy, hierarchical models of leadership, and also objectification of women. So unless we see these radical cultural changes, I don't think the church should be a prophet in this. The church should say, you know what, God's kingdom is different, but it doesn't actively do anything about it. It will elect some people, it'll elect some women in roles, but when it comes to engaging in practices and systems that are actually tending to this issue, it doesn't address. So in part, it's the church's fault, I think. People don't like hearing the truth, especially institutions, because it means they have to change and they have to do some serious self-reflection on what they are committed and what they are about. The truth will set you free, right? That's John 8:32, right? The if you know the truth will set you free. But as Gloria Steinem kind of quoted, it first will really make people mad. That's a paraphrase, but the truth is really, really hard to hear, and but it does set you free. And it's in that naming, I think, and you can name it, and then you can go from there and say, what are we going to do about that, or how are we going to call this out? It's a setting free to be who you are, and who God has called you to be, in the fullness of who you are, the fullness of your call, but also the fullness of your identity and your body. And I think that is really freeing, because anytime we try to hide parts of ourselves or cover up parts of ourselves, that's an act of bondage. That's an act of victimization. We feel forced to do it, and or anytime we downplay the fullness of who we are, we have we come under the oppression of another system. And uh, so it's a release to a freedom to be truthfully and wholly who you are. That's how I see it. If you believe in the incarnation, you think that's an important category for understanding who God is, which if you believe in Jesus, you probably should, right? Then then you can't be selectively incarnate, right? You can't choose, well, God shows up in these kinds of bodies, and in this kind of race, and in this kind of gender. If you're committed to the incarnation, you better be committed to the whole thing. You can't be yourself within systems that that try to bring you down. So how can you not be yourself in systems that are patriarchal, or misogynistic or sexist? It's impossible to be fully you in a system like that. But if we can name it, and if we can say this is what it is, how can we then come closer to being who we are? And so I tend to go to particular stories that you see Jesus interacting with women, in particular, women characters in the Bible, who absolutely felt shame and changes their life around. So one example is the Samaritan woman at the well, and how she would have felt incredible shame, not that it was her fault that she was married 5 times, but likely divorced for not being able to have children, or widowed. And so the kind of shame that she would have carried around, having had 5 husbands, again, not her fault, would have been enormous in the first century. And yet Jesus comes to her and says, "Here I am for you. I will provide for you a relationship where I won't leave you ever. And you are more than enough to be a witness to my love." And so it's to her that Jesus says the first "I am" statement in the Gospel of John. I am, meaning I am the very presence of God for you. If you're looking for God, here I am. And it's and then she's the first witness. She goes back to her townspeople and says, "Come and see." And so she is a model witness, model disciple. And it's in that moment, that encounter, that Jesus says, "Yeah, you don't have to bear this anymore. This is I have a different life for you." Yeah, there was no like lightning bolt from the sky. God didn't show up and say, "Hey, I have a plan for your life." There was nothing magnanimous about it. It definitely was a step by step. And I think that for whatever reason, that was an important. I mean, some people experience calls that just like completely sort of reverse their lives, but I think for me, it was important to see the ways in which the manifestations of my life were all kind of coming together. So I feel like my experience as a violinist and performance and in music is deeply integrated in what I do right now. And I don't know if I would be the kind of biblical interpreter, the kind of preacher, without having had that experience. But for me, that's where the music piece comes in, because you learn a piece not to uh, just say you learned it, but you learn it for the sake of a moment in time to perform it. And it's in that moment of time that is uniquely yours, and a uniquely incarnated moment of that particular piece. That's what a sermon is, right? It's an interpretation of text and time that you can never get back. And it's its own unique experience. And so that's what I feel needs to happen once you've figured out, gosh, what is this text about? It actually hasn't reached its full meaning until it's performed, until it's embodied and given life in the preacher and in the listener. Grace for me is radically contextualized, that there's no one definition of it. And if I was going to give it one definition, it would be the absolute assurance of the presence of God. Now, then, how God reveals God's self in that moment can be experienced in different ways. Where I ground this is in John 1, the prologue, John 1, 1 to 18, where the word grace is used 4 times. And then in 1:16, from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. But then after the prologue, the word grace is never used again in the entire Gospel of John. Well, why is that? It's a fine word. You'd think that Jesus would use it, or the author of John would use it. Well, that's because grace becomes incarnated. Grace becomes embodied. Grace becomes experienced. So the rest of the gospel then creates experiences of what does it feel like, look like, taste like, smell like, sound like, to experience grace upon grace. So that's why the very first thing that Jesus does in John is water into wine. Well, it's not just water into wine; it's a lot of water into the best wine. 20, 30, 20, 30, 6 jugs, 20, 30 gallons filled to the brim of the best wine when you least expect it. So what does grace upon grace taste like? Tastes like the best wine, and a ton of it when you least imagine it happening. When Jesus introduces the Spirit in John, he says, I'm leaving you, going to my Father, but he says, I'm sending you another advocate. So he has already been an advocate, right? He's already been an advocate, and the word there in John is paraclete, which is literally the one who is called alongside you. It's the one who walks parallel to you. And I think that's what I would want my legacy to be, is that people would know that I could come alongside them, and not just to walk along, but to empower them, inspire them to be the live in the fullness of who God has called them to be, to live their truth, to live from the deepest truth that they have, and to discover that. And so in that sense, it's an advocacy, and that an advocate for living your truth and living the fullness of who God has called you to be.